Ash, thank you so much for joining me on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast to talk about your language learning experiences and software and all the things that you do. How did you get into language learning in the first place?
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I've always had a fondness for things foreign. I mean, I don't know why. As a kid, I collected foreign money. Right. And I would watch these World War II movies where these people were speaking German, and I thought that was the coolest thing in the world.
Right.
Years later, after I learned German, I saw some of those movies again and realized how terrible the German was. It's usually Americans speaking very bad German on the movies, but
right.
At any rate, I thought it was really cool as a kid. I used to play in a death metal band like in the early 90s. And we had this Dutch band came over to the U.S. and they ended up staying at our apartment. And they were like, "Oh, you should come to Holland next summer." I'm like, "I'm going to do that. And when I get there, I'll be speaking Dutch."
Right.
And they didn't really believe me, but I didn't even know how I was going to do it. I just knew I was going to do it. And I learned Dutch in about 10 months. And when I went there, I refused to speak English. And within a couple of months, I could like interpret church services.
Right.
At the time, I thought it was because I was smart, but it's not. It's because English and Dutch are extremely close languages.
Right.
Because you can't do that with Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese. Yeah.
No, I would second that. I mean, German is in many ways free. You know, there's just a few little things to remember, and then you get all kinds of, other words, of course, that are more, I guess, of Slavic origin, etc. But it's like Spanish in a sense, where if you can unlock a few rules, you get thousands of words just almost for free. And I don't know Dutch, but I imagine it's quite similar in that regard, and all the more so if you knew German.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah.
So tell us then about Asian languages and those specific challenges and your journey to getting so good with Chinese in particular.
Well, so the big thing, why is Spanish easier for an American? Why is German easier for America? It's because we share a cultural heritage with those languages. Latin was the language of education in Europe in the Middle Ages. So all these European languages have words that come from Latin. And right. These are like these things. And then you also have obviously the related languages like Dutch and German and English and Norwegian and Swedish and Danish. They're all related. So they all have words that might be slightly pronounced different, or might be pronounced slightly differently or used differently. But once you recognize them, you could really grab onto it. With Asian languages, I mean, it's a complete chasm. I mean, the culture is different. And like, especially with Chinese, even the words that come from English, you have to be an advanced speaker of Chinese to even recognize the English words, because they're so twisted, because the phonology of Mandarin is so completely, or Cantonese even, is so different from English.
Right.
So you don't even recognize them as English words. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm trying to think of a good example, but all the bad words come to my head that they say from English. Well, I'll just say it. Like, so English shit
right.
in Chinese or in Taiwan, they say 血特.
Right.
That's like, that sounds to me nothing, even though I know it's supposed to be the same. It sounds nothing like the English word.
Right.
And then the grammar is very different. It's not all of it's very different, but I guess with Mandarin and also Japanese, you have this branching notion. So in English, you say, "That's the guy whose car we saw yesterday." Mm-hmm. Whereas in Chinese, you would say, "That's the we saw his car yesterday guy." Right. So that once you get used to it, it's fine. But some people, it's like a period of adjustment to get used to putting all the modifiers in front of the noun.
Right.
Because in English we say the red car, but we also say, like I just said, the guy whose car we saw yesterday. So not all the modifiers in English go in front of the noun, right?
Right.
Where they do that in Chinese. And then tones blew me away. I showed up in Taiwan in, I think, 2006, 2005. Yeah, 2005 is when I moved there. And I could speak basically fluent, toneless Chinese.
Right.
And it took me several years. Like, basically, I'd been in Taiwan a couple of years, and I went to a I don't know if the right word is a seminar on Chinese paleography and Old Chinese phonology.
Right.
And so paleography being the origin and evolution of the script, and Old Chinese being roughly the Book of Odes, like 3,000 years ago, the Chinese that was spoken in those days, the sounds of that language, like trying to reconstruct it.
Right.
And there was I knew that I'd be speaking more quote unquote fluent Chinese than the other people in our group because I've been living in Taiwan for several years. Well, I got there expecting praise because of that, and this famous linguist pulls me aside. He's like, Ash, your tones are crap,
Right.
like really bad. And I knew it. I just didn't know how to solve the problem. And I just laughed when he said it because I knew he was right. And he's like, I'm not trying to, make you depressed or whatever. I'm like, no, you're totally right, So I went back to Taiwan and I started trying to figure out how to fix the tones. But the real problem is thinking. If you don't think about the problem correctly, it's very difficult to come up with a solution. In fact, coming up with a solution is basically an exercise in learning how to think about the problem correctly.
Right.
So most people, including myself, like when I learned Dutch, I did it mostly through reading and writing, and so my listening comprehension wasn't very good. And in that period of a few months from the time I got to Holland to the time I could actually interpret, that was a whole period of adjusting, basically a transfer function in my head from the Dutch in my head to the actual Dutch, and what is the transfer function that connects these two, like. But you can actually learn a language without having to go through that process. And the way you do it is you focus on pronunciation from the get-go.
Right.
And a lot of people, and I think it's more important to have this when you're dealing with a language that's much more different from English. Like you can not even worry about pronunciation, start speaking Spanish, have a bad accent, and then fix the accent later with much less pain than if you try to do the same thing in Chinese.
Right.
And I know this because I've done it. I've been through it. Actually, I went through it in Dutch, and I also went through it in Chinese, and it was like 10 times harder in Chinese, 10 times more painful of a process.
So let's talk about that, because before we started, we were talking about, N endings versus R endings and so forth. What is right. Pronunciation anyway, especially when the average learner is going to very quickly discover that, wait a second, this is supposed to be pronounced this way, and yet all these people over here are pronouncing it that way, and then they're pronouncing it over there that way. Like, what am I supposed to do?
Right.
You talked about thinking of the problem correctly.
Right.
So, what is that problem, and what is the correct way to solve it so that when you're learning, as the word you used, if I remember previously, was to be nimble. How do you get to that nimbleness?
Right. Okay. So, there's a whole lot in what you just said there. There's a whole lot of things going on.
Right.
One thing is, what is the correct sound? What does that even mean to have a correct sound? If you were to take an English dictionary and look at the pronunciation of all the words in this dictionary, there is no single, say it's American English, there's no single American speaker of English that pronounces all the words in the dictionary like they are in the dictionary.
Right.
But think about that for a minute, because it's very important. If a native speaking American English speaker, even one that's educated with, say, a master's degree in English, is not going to pronounce all the words that they say like they are pronounced in the dictionary. Right. Like, and Dr. William Baxter, he's the guy that pulled me aside and told me my tones were terrible. He was applying this to stuff about Middle Chinese, but it works for this conversation here too. Like, take the name M-A-R-Y, the word M-E-R-R-Y, and the verb to M-A-R-R,
Y, yeah. So the name Mary, to be Mary, and to...
No, to get married.
To get married.
Oh, yeah, you're right. No, you're right.
To marry
right.
someone.
So say that. Yeah, say them again.
So the woman named Mary.
Uh-huh.
The state of being in a state of Mary, as in cheer. and then to marry
Right.
a person.
So like for you, it sounds like they're all the same, which is the same for me. I say Mary was Mary when she got married.
Right.
Right. But my grandparents, they're from Mississippi, and they would say Mary was Mary when she got married.
Yeah,
Like
okay.
for them, all three were different.
Right.
Right. So if I'm a foreigner and I want to learn American English, what sounds do I learn?
Right.
Right. It's not as trivial as a question as it sounds.
No.
And for me, what I would do is I find a native speaker of that language, maybe an actor or somebody on TV or radio personality that I like the way they talk.
Right.
And I may ask a few native speakers, what do you think about the way this guy talks? And if they're not saying, if they say something like, oh, he's a hick from out in the sticks, well, if I'm okay with being identified as a hick from out in the sticks, then that's fine.
Right.
It's really a matter of your identity. So you find somebody who you like their accent and you just copy it. You listen to it all the time. You repeat after it. But we have a notion of standard language, and a lot of language prescriptivists, which are people that'll tell you how to speak like you're doing it wrong. People that say stuff like that are generally prescriptivists, and they try to prescribe how you are supposed to speak a language. So, like you were talking about your teacher in the like I had the same thing when I was learning Cantonese, and I was in Hong Kong, and in Cantonese, L and N as the beginning of a word are the difference is they're all becoming L basically.
Right.
Like traditionally they would say nei ho, but nowadays everybody pretty much says lei ho.
Right.
And like this is ni go, but most people say li go le. But my teacher, when I was taking Cantonese in Hong Kong, she would just ruthlessly police my N's and L's.
Right.
Right? Why is she doing that? Because that's what they do to native speaking kids.
Right. Right.
So she's doing to me, and I'm like, look, lady, this is a hard enough language already without you coming in and telling me to say N's when I walk out on the street, nobody's saying N.
Right.
So I would do it to appease her, but on the street, I'm saying what everybody else is saying.
Yeah.
So you also need to learn, like, what can you believe from a native speaker? What do you believe? When they tell you, hey, that's not the way people say it, definitely believe that.
Right.
Like if I walk up and if I say nei ho, and they're like, hey, nobody says that. Really, nobody. Say lei ho, you should listen to them.
Right.
But if they walk up and tell you that, Jesus or Muhammad spoke their language, you're right in being very skeptical. So native speakers can be, at the same time, the best informant about their language, and that is this word is used like that. Don't use it like this. This word is pronounced this way, not like that.
Right.
And then the worst informants when they're like, "Oh, English is the hardest language in the world to learn." Because the truth is, there is no hardest language in the world. It depends on what languages you already speak as to what other languages would be difficult. For a Cantonese speaker, Spanish is really hard. For me, it's very easy. Why? Because I've already bridged. I'm already in that group. English isn't a Latin language, but has a lot of Latin words, right?
Right.
So know your native speakers. Know what they can help you with and what not to listen to them.
Well, that does,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say that does seem like the ultimate problem, because now we're in the 21st century. Maybe the people listening are not, but and we'd be blessed if that's the case. But there's just so much computer interaction all the time,
Right.
which is going to lend to this is correct stuff, because there's a lot of, especially in the Asian languages or Mandarin, there's all kinds of people on Instagram and etc. who are teaching textbook Mandarin in this particular case, and it's obvious to me that they're not aligned with original speaking. And then I happen to have access to native speakers because of my family, but
Right.
I'll have this experience where my wife, and I'll imitate her accent a little bit here, but she'd say first to tone, very important, first to tone. And I'm just like, that sounds like fourth tone to me, And so I then think, you guys ought to change the number, because this is obviously not first tone the way you're insisting that I say it. But at the
Right.
same time, that imitation, I love that tip of like find a celebrity and imitate that person. That seems like a much better way of getting a foundational field and sort of letting go of the systems, because the systems break down always at some point.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there really is this kind of George Orwell moment where 2 + 2 really does equal 5, you know, because first tone really is the fourth tone in some certain strange universe, right? So what's your take on that? Like what, in your own teaching and experience with pronunciation, like
Well,
where is it useful and where does it break down, and how do you get over those humps?
Okay, there's once again a bunch of stuff here. One of the things is the difference between slow, thoughtful speech and then normal speed in a conversation. It also matters where in a sentence, like things that appear at the end of a sentence are likely to, in Chinese, are likely to have a sentence tone overtake the tone of the word you're saying. Like if you ever go to a Chinese restaurant, at least in Taiwan, if you go to a Chinese restaurant and the waiter's taking your order and they're acknowledging what you said, they'll say how, which is obviously not a third tone, right?
Right.
If they're going by the textbook, it'd be how. But what's happening there is the sentence tone is taking over the syllable tone. So they're saying how, right? That's one thing. Another thing is people's, especially teachers' ideas of what should be done, what should be said, right? So in Mandarin, this plays out in a very big way in the way the third tone is taught.
Right.
People will always teach you to say 我, 我. But if you say 我是, they'll be like, that's wrong.
Right.
Because that's called the isolation tone that you're saying if you're isolatingly just saying one syllable. 我. But nobody says that in actual speech except if they're trying to emphasize something.
Right.
And they especially wouldn't, and the only time they even could say it as a full third tone is when it appears before a pause in speech. Right? So if I say I'm American, you cannot say 我是美国人.
Right.
You have to say 我是美国人.
Right.
I mean, I still remember clearly talking to a Chinese girl. This was 20-something years ago. And I was trying to say the word 比如. And I said 比如. And she's like, no, it's not 比如, it's 比如. And I said, it can't be that because the third tone goes 比. And you skip that second half. But the truth is, if you always say the second half, you'll never be wrong.
Right.
If you always cut out the second half. So instead of saying 我, if you always say 我, you'll never be wrong.
Okay.
So it's actually much better to learn, it's called the half third tone. If you just learn the half third tone, and then when you're an advanced speaker and you want to sound more native in an area where they use the full third, then just notice when they do it and start imitating that.
Right.
So this problem, and the funny thing is Vietnamese has this exact same problem. There's a tone that sounds just like the third tone in Mandarin, and they teach it the same way. Like the word for understanding in Vietnamese is, if you say it in isolation, is hiểu.
Right.
Hiểu. But if you say it in a sentence, it's hiểu.
Right.
Anh hiểu tiếng Việt means I understand Vietnamese. But they teach it the same way the Chinese teach the third tone. And this is because of them trying to teach you the way they teach their kids.
Right.
But the difference between you and the kids is the kids already have a way better knowledge of the language than you do.
Right.
They already understand the sound system is second nature to them. If you tell a Chinese kid, oh, this word over here is pronounced 我, when they say it in a sentence, they're automatically not going to say that. They're automatically going to say 我是.
Right.
Instead of 我是.
So is there some similarity here to music? I know you mentioned you're a musician, and you know we could talk about Mixolydian and we can talk about Phrygian and all that sort of stuff. And some musicians are going to be, well, I don't know what that is, but I can play Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden right now and not skip a beat, right? And
Right.
Whatever those things mean, Lydian and all that, they just have no clue, and yet they're amazing in every way.
Right.
And so I wonder to what extent that language learners get bogged down on things that would really, really help them be musicians better. You know, because if you just know that stuff and you know what belongs to what, then you're going to be ripping out solos much faster if you know it. But if you don't, you're like locked out of this, or you're taking the long way to being able to solo over certain passages in a riff or, you know, whatever's going on in music there. And what I was really impressed with in your character course was this kind of, like, it seems to me a little bit like just buckling down and learning the modes in music to a certain extent, so that you see what's going on from a bird's eye view a little bit. And then you could, it's not exactly the same. It's not like you're going to solo over characters or anything like that, but you know, you're beginning to see the character. So this now is an element that helps unlock a certain structure or a logic that lets me make better guesses about what might be going on. Is there maybe a parallel there to music?
Well, I'm kind of more the guy that doesn't understand Dorian. I mean, I'm not totally. I took music theory in high school, and my guitar teacher, when I was actively learning guitar, taught me Dorian's taught me all kind of Dorian, Ionian, and all that stuff. But I'm old, and that was last time I messed with any of that was at least 25 years ago. So I'm kind of struggling to maintain the analogy. But yeah, the character course, if you're going to spend time to learn 3,000 to 4,000 characters, it is definitely in your best interest to first at least learn memory techniques, even better, learn how the characters actually work, because it's very different from how people say they work. And this is a case where most native speakers are going to be bad informants. They're going to tell you some random, I can't tell you how many crazy stories I've heard about characters. And people know that I'm getting a PhD in paleography. So they'll come to me with these stories, like actively seek me out to come tell me these stories. And they'll tell me, and I'm just like, yeah, I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but that sounds it doesn't even sound like it's probably true to me. It sounds like just some story. And people always ask me, well, what's so bad about stories, right? And, you know, in fact, I learned Chinese. I learned characters myself using memory stories. But what is bad about them is, I mean, it's not bad about them. It's using them properly or not properly. And I would say the proper thing is first understand the structure of the character, understand what the working parts are doing, and then make a memory story on top of that.
Right. If
you just randomly make up memory stories and not understand the character, what's going to happen is you're going to cover up sound and meaning patterns. And basically what our course teaches you is how characters as a system express meaning and sound. And then once you know that, you can use those patterns to remember stuff later. Right. And like for me, I know all about learning with memory stories because I learned my characters with memory stories. But I can tell you this, I learned those memory stories in the late 90s. And I still know how to write now. And I was 6 years in a PhD program for teaching Chinese as a foreign language. I was the first Westerner to take and pass the PhD qualifying exams. Right. And basically I had to memorize about 15 books, obviously not word for word, but memorizing the important concepts in those books. And the test was all written Chinese, no dictionaries, no phones, no nothing, just pen and paper. Right. And like the other Western grad students were waiting to see if I could pass. They were terrified. They wanted to use a computer. Why? Because a Chinese input method kind of works as, in fact, that's what we say our system for characters is. It's a virtual input method. Why can people type Chinese better than can write it? Because they type in the pronunciations they want and they start seeing choices of characters and they can recognize. But for me, I took these 2 6-hour exams in all handwritten Chinese, and there was only like once or twice I had to stop and think about how to write a character. And my memory stories were gone because, you know, I used those in, like I said, the late 90s. Right. My qualifying exams was 2010, so basically 10 years later. But using these meaning and sound patterns, I can work through how to write most of the time. I'm not 100% accuracy, but with very high accuracy, I can if I hadn't seen a character in a long time. In fact, we have stories of this on our website. You can check out some of our blog posts. They actually just go through and describe it step by step. But yeah, so what we're trying to do is in the course is teach you how do you grab a hold of these meaning patterns and sound patterns and use that to recall characters, basically.
Well, that's an amazing part of it, and I love the idea of if you're going to make stories, then make them based on something that's going to reveal underlying patterns, so that
Right.
now the story sort of has more power. I guess, you know,
Well, it's not working against each other. They're working in,
Right.
in engineering would say they add in phase.
Right.
The good points of each are adding toward them, whereas if you make random stories, you're kind of like detracting from one to use the other one. Whereas if you understand the character first and then add a story on top, you're actually getting the best of both worlds. You're adding your input or your output is greater than your input, essentially.
Right. So one of the things that you've done there that I think is really fascinating is essentially add a bit of, correct me if I'm wrong, but like an ideogrammatic etymology that already instantly tells a story, because so many of the root characters, if I can use that term, they are a drawing that refers to something in the world, but is already telling a story about what is trying to be expressed there.
Right.
Is that sort of a decent way of framing it? Because when I use your software inside of Pleco, it seems to me that it's helping me see an earlier version of the character, then telling me essentially the story of what that character was meant to express. And it gets a little confusing because sometimes it's a sound element, sometimes it's a meaning element, and sometimes it's a formal element, if memory serves. And it's just not the same always. And then it's, well, which one do I rely upon? Oh, wait, it's both, and so forth. But nonetheless, there's this core story there already built in.
Right.
And if you can then make a connection to the sound, then you're off and running, and then it's reusable and repeatable.
Well, first of all, root character is exactly correct. In fact, that term in Chinese would be 字根. They actually say that, 字根, which is character root, which means root character. But so yeah, they say that. Yeah. Well, okay, so it's very interesting, and people always call a Chinese writing system a pictographic writing system, but if you look at it from modern Chinese, only like 1% or 2% of characters are actually pictographic. And you can't, and one of the things actually we want to do with our dictionary is to bring back this pictographicness to it, that you can actually see the image you're supposed to see in the character form. But most characters aren't just pictographic. So you have, in fact, the most common character would be sound meaning character, where you have a meaning, a semantic component and a sound component. And it really depends on what point in history this thing was created as to whether the semantic component is giving that meaning via its picture quality. But very early characters are mostly picto. They use the pictureness of the forms to tell a story. Like a very poignant example of this would be like ji, meaning sacrifice. Anyway, sacrifice. So it's a picture, it's a piece of meat in a hand grabbing a piece of meat and putting it on an altar.
Right.
And it means sacrifice. Right. So that's a very picturesque, like that's really just a kind of a ancient photograph, if you will, of a sacrifice, right?
Right.
But then what happens is, over time, these forms start to become more and more stylized. And at the same time, they're also collecting meanings. Like, so the thing we write as tree in a character, if you speak it out, it actually means wood instead of tree. Well, obviously wood comes from trees, so this is an extended meaning of that component.
Right.
And so as characters evolve over time, they become more and more stylized. So, in other words, you can't see the pictureness to them as much. And they're also collecting meanings. So then they start adding those things together, which is a different kind of character.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, essentially what you said is correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is always the challenge. And I think you've done great things in the course to help solve it. And I love how you're bringing together actual instruction then with this tool that helps with peering through it. And, you know, I haven't had enough time to spend with it as I would like. as we were preparing for this interview, I decided not to take level 4 in the Confucius Institute simply because they're having it in the evening, and it's just not the best time for me. So I think I got a lot out of level 3, and it was just sort of while I was taking your course, and I thought, oh wow, I'm going to take level 4, but I couldn't convince them to do it at a reasonable hour, like 10 a.m.
Right.
But anyway, I'll get back into a course eventually, because I think for me as a learner, as long as it's just very few students, I actually do find courses quite useful, at least in Chinese, because it doesn't have the Spanish or German cognate effect, right? Where you just blitz through a lot of stuff. But the sort of interesting question that I have, and I don't know that there's an answer, but I'm curious what your response would be nonetheless, is when I got your course, I was also able to get a sort of document with a number of characters to follow. And yet it seems like there's always a catch, right? Because, well, I don't need that character right now, and I don't need actually any of those on here. Right. And it always seems to be like, I wish somebody would just give me the characters that make sense to learn right now without me needing to talk to anybody or needing a teacher or anything like this, which I know is sort of unrealistic. But I'm still sort of curious what your answer would be. How do I ultimately become the best curator of my own journey, so that I feel like every day I'm making a step forward without wasting time? Again, I sort of know the answer to this, but I'm curious, or an answer, what your response is to that.
Well, okay, the basic problem, though, with characters is that what makes sense to teach you about characters may or may not make any sense as to what you're doing in a spoken language.
Right.
Right. And I think you're always going to be better off being able to speak before you learn how to write. I mean, there's a bunch of ways of doing that. It's like, one, you could spend 2 years only speaking and not touch writing, and then at the end of the 2 years, you start into writing. Or you could just learn how to say a phrase first, and then once you got the phrase down, 2 days later, you learn the characters in that phrase that you already know. Right. But it's definitely much better to, like, in fact, we have a whole lesson on this in the course about, it's called the, this word's not coming to my head right now. It's a term from computer engineering and how computer processors spread out commands in the computer, and it's like doing laundry. We use an example of doing laundry. Right. You could either take your clothes, throw them in the wash, wait for them to come out, throw them in the dryer, wait for them to come out, dry them, and then take your next load and put it in the wash. Or you could do one load of wash, throw that in the dryer, put the next one in the wash. The one in the dryer comes out, you hang those up, put the one in the wash in the dryer, then put another load in the wash, right? And that's actually kind of how you should learn characters. And except that you're learning the spoken part before the character part. Right. But I do want to touch on what you're saying, because we actually had a student who was really, he kept telling me, look, I don't want to learn this ancient stuff. And when he would say that, I didn't even know what he was talking about. What do you mean learn this ancient stuff? He's like, well, you're wanting us to learn all this historical stuff. And I'm like, I am? Like, I mean, because in my mind, that's not what I'm doing. Like, in my mind, I'm showing you, if you want to understand how this character works, you need to understand these parts over here. And he always saw this as being extra information. And so I would try to convince him as best I could. In fact, you and I wrote you an email about this. That's how this whole thing got started, because you said something about one of your students, something about you have to do what I'm telling you to do in order to get the benefit of the program. If you don't do what I tell you to do, you're not going to feel the benefits. Right. And that kind of, he was doing the same thing, and I was sincerely trying to convince him, but he never got convinced. And but the thing is, there's these other students who, like a Dutch guy named Edsko. He was the first version of the course we actually had, where you could sign up to do videos conferencing with us once a week. Turns out that was it was very fun, but it was we got so much work to do that it just wasn't really worth the time to do it. But it's very fun. And Edsko was one of the guys in our online class, and he told me one day, he's like, you're always telling me to learn this and this and that, and I look at it, I was thinking, that really just doesn't look like it's important to me. It really doesn't look like it's something I need, but I just decided I took your course, I'm gonna trust what you say, and I'm just gonna go ahead and learn it anyway. And he goes, and I'll be damned if that isn't the stuff that helps me remember characters later. And I'm like, yeah. He gets it. That's exactly right. I am not telling you to go out and learn a bunch of stuff that isn't going to be useful to you. In fact, for me, I'm extremely, if I'm going to ask a student to learn quote unquote an extra thing, I'm going to make sure you get a huge benefit from it. I am not going to, out of the idea of this is the perfect way of doing it or whatnot, I'm not going to, I don't make decisions like that. I make decisions, if I ask this person to memorize this, is that going to help them a lot?
Right.
If it's only going to help a little bit, then I'm not going to make you memorize it. In fact, that's why we don't even, in the dictionary, we don't tell you what to memorize. We give you the information, and then I just trust that you're a learner. You need to understand how to learn and what's useful for you and not for you. But yeah, so I don't know. I don't see it as, to me, I see, because I'm going at this from the other direction. Like you guys, you're learning the characters, so you're progressing through being good at characters. But I'm like, I mastered them 10, 15 years ago, and I'm going back and say, okay, of the stuff, when I'm sitting, like when I was taking those exams, I'm sitting there writing characters, and there were a few times I had to stop and kind of like write on the margins of to try to figure out how to write a character, because I'm going through, okay, it sounds like this, what things can represent that sound? It means this, what things can represent that meaning? And I was able to pull out a character that I hadn't even thought about in a year, right? So I'm thinking from the perspective of, as somebody who's mastered characters, what little things tweak my memory to allow me to recall this stuff years later after my memory stories have all fallen away.
Right.
So I'm actually approaching this, and I was telling this guy this. I was like, dude, and I don't want to, you can't really say this to a person, but it's like our opinions are not equal on this matter.
Right.
I was telling him the whole story about, I went from, like when I first started learning characters, I learned my first, and this is like early 90s, probably 93, 94. My first 100 characters, I didn't have any memory systems. I was just doing it by rote, and I thought, dude, this ain't nothing but a thing. This ain't nothing. What is everybody so freaked out about Chinese characters? And I just kept doing what I was doing, and then I got to about 1,500, and the whole system just kaboom! It just completely collapsed on itself. And I basically, it was just a big mush in my head, and I could like, hey, I learned that character before. I got no idea what it sounds like or what it means, but I know I learned it. And hey, I know that one's got 3 sounds. I don't know what they are. I just know it's got 3. Hey, that character has something to do with trees. And so I was left with this terrible, like, collapsed, system, basically thinking I'd wasted all my time. And that's actually what got me into memory stuff.
Right.
Because this guy is an English guy. He had this website back in like 99, 2000. It's been down for like probably since 2001, but he talked about memory stories, and he had gone to Taiwan, and somebody had taught him these memory story, how to do memory stories for Chinese, and he had mastered thousands of characters in a year and a half. And I read it, and before that I would have just blown it off, because I'm an engineer. I come from a very hard science background, and a lot of stuff, it just sounds like fluff to me. I just blow it off. Right. But I saw it, and I started reading what he was saying, and he was saying this would solve that problem, and then I would see something else, and I'd say, oh, that would solve this problem I'm having. And I could just see how this memory stuff actually works. And so I got into it, and then I mastered characters in a couple of years. In fact, I was most of my Chinese characters and vocabulary I learned while I was working as an engineer full time and getting a master's in electrical engineering. Right. And almost the only time I had was on Sundays when I didn't do work or school. I would make up cards, like basically Anki. It would be Anki today, but it was Super Memo back then. Right. And then the rest of the week, when I'm at a stoplight, I don't recommend doing that, but when I was at a stoplight, I was doing cards. When I was walking to class, I was doing cards, and I wore the buttons out of my Palm OS device on both sides from doing these cards. Right. And yeah, and so it's like so he's telling me this stuff is extra information. I'm like, look, dude, I'm telling you, it's not. This is this stuff it's the core. It's the stuff you have to know. And I even had EDSCO talk to this guy and say, look, explain to him what you told me, because I can't tell him the way you're telling me. Because for me, I've been on this teacher end of it so long, it's hard for me to remember back what it was like to be on that end. And so I really like it when students write me and ask me questions, because these questions help remind, oh yeah, I remember thinking like that. It helps me to keep current as far as what they're thinking, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, to me, this seems like the ultimate problem that I hope humanity can solve, because all the technology in the world doesn't seem to be changing the fundamental fact that some people listen to what more experienced people say, and some people don't.
I don't think technology can solve that problem.
Well, you never know. I mean, with Neuralink or whatever, maybe they just like, zap you, and this is like, they know because they're the teacher. But then we also know that teachers fail. We know that sometimes teachers do have bad advice, etc. And we also know that there's timing and context to everything. But when I take your course, you know, and I'll save this for people who also take your course, you mentioned a couple of books that you should consider reading. And so I think that is a gift, right? And so, you know, what do? Well, you know that there's the speed of implementation rule, so you go and you order those books. Even if they're going to sit on your shelf for a couple of months before you have time to get to them or whatever, I'm waiting for another class that I might take and put it in the context of actually showing up, etc. Like, I know that those are the gift that you're giving the student, is like, these are the books I read. They were the most impactful for me. I'll save you, you know, all 15, but here's, you know, the top 3.
Right.
Go and get those and read those. I see that as the gift, but I don't yet understand why others don't. You know,
right?
And
well, we live in an age where there's so many voices, right? I mean, you get on the internet and you do a search on anything, and all these pages are going to come up, and people claiming to be experts, and people I know, I see them post on Facebook, and I know they don't know anything about what they're posting, but they come across like they're experts.
Right.
And I want to say something, but I don't want to go through the whole personal trouble of them getting mad and all that stuff. So I just kind of look at it and go, well, okay, I know they don't know anything about that topic they're claiming to be experts on, but whatever, I'm just going to. So I feel like it's my responsibility, and it's our responsibility as a company, to convince people that we know what we're talking about. But actually, this right here is our biggest problem, because our dictionary, when we present characters to you, the information looks simple, but it's what you don't see is that I spent 7 years full time preparing the skill set to do this dictionary. 7 years. And I'm not a native Chinese speaker. I'm a native English speaker. So I know what it's like for a native English speaker or a Westerner to go through this process, to whereas your Chinese teachers probably have no clue.
Right.
And I also have a very hard science background. I worked for NASA. I did antenna engineering for NASA for 3 years. Like, my stuff flew in space. In fact, the astronaut spacesuit backpack antennas that flew after the year 1999 were all ones that I did. I didn't design them, but I did all the testing to get the design qualified for spaceflight. And when they manufactured them, I tested them to make sure they were built according to spec, and then I tuned them. So basically, all the spacesuit backpack antennas used after 1999, I did that. Right? So I got this hard science background, and it makes a difference. It helps you think very logically. So. And actually, that's also what drove me to spend that 7 years. I knew I need to understand Old Chinese phonology. If I'm going to figure out why these sound series and Chinese characters, some of them look totally easy to understand. Other ones are like, what the heck? How could that possibly be the sound component? In order to understand that kind of stuff, you have to go back to understanding this Old Chinese phonology. And then that led into understanding Chinese paleography, because the origin and evolution of characters is super complex. Like, it's like worse than quantum mechanics. Like, it's just so much insane stuff happens. It's just awesome. I love it. It makes life much more fun for me, because I get to see this all the time. But the dictionary is actually, there's all this heavy research that's gone on behind the scenes in what you're seeing. You're just seeing this simple entry. And so some people will say, oh, well, I can download a list like that for free on the internet. It's like, no, you can't. There is nothing like this on the internet. In fact, this is the only project in English that I know of that's actually based on Chinese paleography, where we're explaining characters to you based upon the last 100 years of research into this stuff on a very serious level, not some like kiddie level. But we don't know how to advertise that. We don't know how to, because if you start talking about PhD research, it scares people off, and they think you're going to beat them over the head with a bunch of complicated stuff, which is actually the opposite of what we're trying to do.
Right.
Yeah, it's very frustrating for us, though. You know.
Well, we could probably mastermind up some ideas for you. You know.
Well, That would be highly. In fact, I actually thought about contacting you years ago, just because you do specialize in doing memory stuff. Like I use memory techniques on a regular basis, but I've never like actually gone out and tried to master them or gone out and tried to understand the psychology behind them. For me, it's like I just want to spend enough time just to learn that one technique to get the job done I'm trying to do right now. Right. But you're doing for memory stuff what I'm doing for characters. Like with the characters.
One way to think about it is, what is it that finally convinced you to use some memory stuff? And you were telling me before, how you get the whole thing about associating a memory palace with the alphabet. And, what was it that convinced you to actually try that and pay it its due? Because when you do pay it its due, it pays off. What was the secret there?
So the secret was failure. I mean, the secret was spending hours and hours and hours. I literally have a stack of notebooks. And I'm not joking. I still have this in storage here in Austin of me just writing characters over and over and over and over and over and over again. And native speakers will tell you to actually do that. But guess what? They already know Chinese.
Right.
All they're trying to do is take a symbol and associate it with the word and a pronunciation that is super intimate to them. Like they couldn't even live without that pronunciation and without that grammar and all that. It's second nature to them. Whereas as a foreigner, you're trying to learn the whole kit and caboodle, man. You're trying to do pronunciation, you're trying to do tones, you're trying to do Chengyu, you're trying to do grammar, you're trying to do set sayings, you're trying to do like a gazillion different things, and you just can't do all those things at the same time. I know because I've tried it. But yeah, failure. And actually, I even had this problem back in those days because I was like, dude, I was trying to preach the gospel of this memory system because I knew it solved all these problems. And I would tell people about it thinking, expecting them to, hooray, you're a hero, we're saved. And when you get, that's a waste of time.
Right.
It's like, no, but it's not a waste of time. I know 100% for sure it's not. And like people just won't. And my theory back then is I just stopped telling people about it. And the reason is I just thought, well, or I told them and I expected them to reject it. And I thought, well, whenever they fail, then they'll think about it and then they'll maybe come back and do this memory thing. But I think a lot of people, the memory technique stuff is pie in the sky to most people. Right. But it's really not. They think it's oh, this is a technique that other people can do. And like I come from a perspective. I used to totally believe in talent. Like people are born with talent. I mean, I still to some degree believe that. But it's not a static thing. It's something that can totally change. And like, why was Richard Feynman so good at physics? Well, his dad was teaching him about physics when he was like 5 years old. So he learned a way of thinking about physics back when he was learning how to think about the world. And then who are the best musicians? The one that come from musician families. Yeah. Because they have a head start over people that that have to learn everything on their own and they learn it at a later time. That's not to say those people can't catch up to some degree, but intelligence is not, your IQ is not set from the day you're born to the day you die. There's a ton of things you can do to either lower it or increase it. And this memory stuff is one of the things that you can do to actually increase your IQ. Yep. I mean, I don't know if it actually increases your IQ, but you can make other people think that it has been increased.
Yeah, I think IQ is the wrong question, but I think you can increase your intelligence, and memory is the way to do it. And so I think part of what would really help people is, I haven't had enough time to spend with what you're teaching at a granular level. But the thing that's very clear to me in what you're suggesting and saying is that it is a thing where if you just ignore the kind of murkiness of what you're suggesting, which is going to be there naturally, and dive in and actually follow it, it's inevitable that it can help, because it's got a relationship to the memory techniques, which is it is a technique by which you separate things into components and then allow that process of separation and analysis in the separation to somehow start to build a clarity that time using that approach is going to create a phalanx, so to speak, that will allow you to push forward through more darkness and give your soldiers with their shields that are pushing into the darkness more torches and better torches as you go. I can see that very, very clearly from what you're doing. And I'm excited to spend more time with this approach. And it's this exact same thing with memory techniques. And everybody's going to have a different port of entry. Everybody's going to have a different set of tools when they get into it. But it's exactly the Fineman thing. And I'm glad you mentioned him, because it's time spent asking the right questions and knowing what the real problem is. And so I think what you've done is directed me at looking at the problem differently. Because when I looked at characters before, and I worked it out where I was memorizing one character in about 5 minutes with the character, the tone, the actual numbers of the tones using the major. And I just thought, great, that's great. But somehow it's missing a certain je ne sais quoi. It's not really helping me learn more characters as I go along. It's like the same 5 minutes every time.
Yeah, it's equally difficult.
Sort of mind map and so on.
I mean, eventually you will start figuring out these sound patterns and meaning patterns, except the fact that A, it's going to take a lot more pain and suffering to get them, and B, it's going to be way less accurate than if you do it our way. Like, our way will actually get you more accurate than a native speaker as far as understanding how characters work, because native speakers they don't learn how characters work. They do understand on an intuitive level. Like, if you point a character to a native speaker and they'll say, well, it could be pronounced like this, but they couldn't tell you why they think that.
Right.
And they say, well, it could mean these things, but they can't tell you why they think that. And then also, because Mandarin is so incredibly different from Old Chinese, there's a lot of sound connections you're going to completely miss. Right. Because they won't be able to get it from Mandarin sounds. It's just not even possible. So you actually have to learn it from some other way, and most of them don't know it. So if you learn using our way, you will develop this feel for sound and meaning representation much faster and much more accurately. Basically, when you need it when you're learning, not years later, right? So that's what we're trying to do. But I want to go back to something you were talking about, this light concept, because this is exactly how I describe. So if you think of it just a blank room, like a 10 by 10 by 10 room, and if the room is totally dark, that means you don't understand that thing at all. And if it's totally light, it means that you understand it perfectly. Right. Well, for each character you learn, the more light there is in that room, because that darkness is also doubt, and doubt actually works against learning. Even though you're trying to memorize stuff, the doubt, actually your brain will doubt that you should learn that thing, which is why it's so hard to learn random things. Right. The brain hates random things. It loves things of pattern. Right? So what we're doing is, I spent the 7 years understanding how to do character research, and I've gone in and I've used my 7 years of experience to come in and analyze a character, break it down into its functional parts, and tell you this part is doing that part is doing this is how that character works. You don't have to do that. All you got to do is read it. Right. I mean, you're going to have to do some kind of some memorization. You decide what you want to memorize and what you don't, and you should probably be experimenting what works for you, because there is no one formula that works for everybody. Everybody has, in fact, one of the things I was saying earlier, I was going to contact you about years ago. I didn't end up doing it because I'm still kind of wavering on the issue, but I would love to have kind of an official memory system for our stuff, because like I said, I really do think that understanding of the character, its component parts, and then having a systematic memory tool to learn on top of that would just be super powerful. But the thing that gives me pause is these memory objects you come up with are really personal. I mean, not you. I mean, the royal you.
Well, actually, that's the problem, is a lot of people don't make them personal. And that's the number one issue I see from my end. But carry on. I'll have some things to say that I think might be useful. Okay. So, like right now, I use the major system a lot. Talking about using it for tones. It works. I can still remember just off the top of my head when I learned in Cantonese. I have this picture of a maid in a French maid's uniform standing in a coffee cup. Right. Obviously a large coffee cup. And so maid is 1-3, right? And the word for coffee in Cantonese, 3-1. Yeah. 3-1. It's funny because when I said 1-3, I'm thinking the tones don't work. Oh, that's because I said it wrong. You know, I never correct people when they tell me how they use the major, because you could have 1 as an M and 3 as
well, you could, yeah.
But I never assume that you've done it, as I've done it. But anyway.
No, yeah. I do it the kind of the
Typically, it would be
standard
31
way.
would be M and a maid, yeah.
So it's cafe, cafe. Unlike Mandarin, which is cafe, it's like 1-1, right? Cafe, but Cantonese is cafe.
Right.
It's like, especially with, but now I'm using it in Japanese for this pitch accent, because pitch accent's also a lot of times represented as a number. And then also you have two different types of verbs in Japanese, and how you conjugate the verbs depends on what type of verb it is. So, like, yeah, they're called, like, in Japanese they're called one break verbs and 5 break verbs, or 5 section verbs. And so 5 is L, and then the pitch accent will be, so like, you ever listen to Motorhead, or you know who Motorhead is?
But of course, long live Lemmy.
Yes. Lemmy. So Lemmy is one of my memory characters, because he's the L is for 5 and means Godon, like 5 section verb, and then the M is for the third Mora pitch accent.
Right.
So Lemmy, but you know, using these characters is really fun. Like, for instance, my father passed away, I don't know, 2004. But he's actually in my Japanese learning system, and it's actually, I see him all the time now, because he's my memory. He's part of my memory story, and it actually brings me joy just to see his face in my mind. Yeah. And that's kind of a weird thing, but it's true. It's like, I'm not really seeing him, but it feels like I'm seeing him. You know?
Right.
So I think I read something that you wrote about, maybe one of your emails, about how using memory systems can, like, actually help depression or something. Was that you?
It's not just me. There is great research. Tim Dalglish is one of the front runners in producing, or I should say Tim Dalglish et al., because there's a number of people that are involved in the write-ups of his research, and certainly producing the studies. And it is, very simply put, if you were to have a memory palace, let's just say it has 4 stations, and you had 4 positive memories, you notice yourself going into a bad mood, and you just go to memory number 1, positive memory, and memory number 2, etc. Almost certainly what this boils down to is a dopamine spike that, if they're very personal and involve someone else, you'll probably get some serotonin, perhaps some oxytocin out of it. Other opioid receptors are going to be flashing on. Maybe some myelin will be involved, etc. Like, that's all the science stuff, right? I'm not a neuroscientist or anything like that, but that's what I've read and memorized from all the words that are involved in those studies. But yeah, and that's the problem, I think, with memory teaching, is that people learn the major, or something along these lines, the Dominic or whatever, and they're taught to memorize, associate the numbers with a bunch of stuff that has no meaning to them, right? Mm-hmm. So, like a maid, to take that example. Well, I use the word maid, but I personalized it, because I have somewhere in my memory the image of the Mad Magazine mascot dressed as a maid. And I love Mad Newman Magazine. Yeah.
Alfred, yeah, me too. I used to collect those when I was a kid.
Right. But that jump now is not this abstract idea of a maid. It's not even the abstract idea of Mad Magazine. It is the very specific memory that I could never tell you which issue it was, or even what year it was, where I know I saw him as a maid, right? So this is already a quantum leap, if I can dare use such a misused word as quantum. But it is. It's a quantum leap ahead of any other sort of thing. And people will come up to the Dominic, right? And they'll be like, I want to use that. And he'll be talking about, whatever his way of doing it. And they'll think, oh, well, why doesn't Charlie Chaplin work for me for 33? It should, because it's C3 is the third letter of the alphabet and so forth. Well, how many hours have you spent watching Charlie Chaplin? Right. Why don't you think originally and think about what's already in your cellular matter, ideally something that's positive and happy for you, and then you're already going to hit the ground running. And it's the same sort of thing with if you're going to use the major to associate with tones, right? So just a classic example, and this might be one of those ones where the 3 tone wouldn't be pronounced because you just focus on the last tone, but like Junbei, right? Like that sort of thing. To remember that that's 3 and 4, well, 3 and 4 for me is mare, that word mare, right? But it's very specifically the nightmare from the Piers Anthony novel Nightmare. So already, nobody else would know that, but I did the work. To go from just, it could have been MR, it could be any sorts of things. It could be Jennifer Marr that I knew in university. It could be whatever. All that matters is that it's not something abstract. And even if it is abstract, I push it to be specific.
Right.
And I find that that's what's missing from so much of the memory training, is that they just say, oh, well, pencil, chicken, tree, etc. No, and 1,000.
And it has to be stuff that because that's one thing I've definitely noticed when using this kind of tool is that sometimes, like, I've actually had, like, when I was learning Chinese characters actively, I had the 4 tone people. And one of my tone people just morphed into somebody else, completely my brain just totally morphed that person, and all my stories just changed, and I couldn't go back to the original one, even though I kind of like wanted to, because like that's what I was supposed to do, but my brain just wanted that person to be this other person, and it worked better. So if you have if you're using your memory system and like Charlie Chaplin doesn't work, well, change it. Put something in there that works for you. Put something in the first thing that comes to your mind. That's something that that's personal, because it's the personal part of it that actually makes it work.
Right. Yeah. So my answer to your desire to have a dedicated memory system is don't have a dedicated memory system. Teach people to use the methods and the principles that actually get you to the high order skill, because you have to build the systems. And just as you pointed out, you will have things inside of you that will cause you to transform the system, which means it's no system at all. It's a method, right? And so I'd be very delighted and honored to be a part of anything. If you want to make recommendations, and there's little special links to do that, so that there's, all kinds of, economic, spiritual karma that is involved in that, if you know what I mean. But at the end of the day, I think the best thing you could do for people, even though it's a bit harder and it might give them cognitive overload because there's no system except for the one that they have to create themselves, and it's not really a system, at the end of the day, that's the more truthful and direct path, as what I admire so much in what you're teaching. And even with the minimal amount of experience I've been able to go into it so far, I can see that this is precisely where we are related in many, many ways in terms of authentic pedagogy that isn't going to dance around with all kinds of la-di-da sort of stuff. The reality is you're never on your own if you do it right, but you're always on your own. And that's another great thing in your course. Like the Heart Sutra comes up, and I was just like, what an amazing gift. Now, I didn't end up going that far with the Heart Sutra, but I can always revisit it because it's there. It's mentioned in the course, and I memorized a little bit of it. And then I was speaking with my father-in-law on WeChat, and he just kind of like downplayed it a little bit. And he's like, nobody's going to use many of those characters, and maybe there's a reason why. That has to do with things we don't have to get into there, why that particular text would be downplayed in my learning. But he then said, why don't you memorize, characters or work with characters from this text instead, and so, or movies or something that is in common parlance, many more characters. Right. But I never would have gone in that direction without that course. But anyway, I'm grateful that you are taking this at the level that you are. And I think that in terms of having the dedicated memory system, don't, because it's not to the truth. The truth is,
I was just thinking that as you were talking, I was thinking you could have a system in the sense of come up with a person's name that's M and has M and M in it, and then vowels, and then come up with, and then that represents this thing over here. So you kind of like lead them to show what's important to have a memory person for, but then leave the actual memory person up to them.
Right. Yeah, look, I don't want to get hung up on the semantics of what the word system means versus.
No, I don't even care about that stuff. So.
But yes, by all means, people can have systems, and there is a systematic way to show the teaching for sure. I think that a lot of people then never get as far as they could because no one tells them straight up. Look, this is sort of thing where you're never on your own because it's already in your head, but you are on your own to develop these things. And if you get caught, this is almost certainly the problem. You're getting caught because you're not being specific enough. Not only that, but the thing is if you want to remember it for the long haul, it's not just about, okay, so I'm going to have a horse for 34 and it's going to be a specific horse, and I'm going to have the maid for 31, but it's going to be a very specific character. What it's also about is, do I have a kinesthetic sense of it? Like, do I remember having Mad Magazine in my hands? right?
Oh,
Do I have
okay.
an auditory sense? Like, what would the sound of that maid be like? It's just like, oh, you're lifting up my dress. And, what does it look like visually? I don't see pictures in my head, but nonetheless, I have a sense of what that would look like visually. And then what's the emotion? So Mad Magazine is always like this snarky sort of laughter. What's the
Right.
concept involved here, right? That can go all over the place. What's maybe the taste? What's the smell? And what's the space involved? You put all that stuff
Right.
together with each and every image you create, you have just racked up your progress.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's just
That,
simple.
actually, that's one of the main points that guy. I should know his name off the top of my head, but I can't think of it. Anyway, the guy that came up with the memory system I use for characters, he was saying you have to make everything very experiential, like you can actually feel and taste and see. And when you do your stories, actually picture yourself in that room and, talking to that person. And it is true, because when you actually, you kind of get lazy and you're like, oh, okay, well, I'll just kind of fluffle through this thing. But if you actually take the time and you do that, you end up spending less time in the long run because it makes a deeper impression the first time.
Yeah. Oh, and believe me, it's the strangest thing, but doing it right the first time is the easiest thing to forget in the world.
That dude with pronunciation, that's like 10 times. Like I can tell you. In fact, I'm so obsessed with Japanese pitch accent is because of my experience with Mandarin. I do not want to go through that again. I realize I'm going to get this thing down right the first time and not spend years correcting it. But I want to say one more thing real quick about this major method, because there's something very interesting, and I've experienced this on like several times, because I use this. That's probably the most common memory tool I use. Right. And that is, you create these objects for certain things. Like I was saying, in Japanese, it's a certain type of verb and then the pitch accent in that verb. And then so whenever I'm doing my cards on verb conjugations, the first thing I do is think, okay, what is the memory object for this verb? And then I think of the sounds of the verb, which is also helped by the memory object because it tells me where the pitch is. And then I start going into the conjugation. So the funny thing is you think up the memory object and then you kind of decode it to get to the verb information you want. But what ends up happening when you do this enough times is you end up seeing the memory object and immediately it goes to the correct verb conjugation and pitch accent placement, and you're not even thinking about it.
Right.
So it's you don't even have to decode the object. You just see the object and know what it's supposed to be. And that's the weirdest thing. I mean, I guess it's normal, but it just feels weird. And I had the same thing. I was learning Taiwanese, like the dialect Taiwanese many years ago. And Taiwanese, like in Mandarin, you have two, three tones next to each other. The first one becomes the second tone.
Right, that's Sandy, is it called?
Tone Sandy. Well, this happens in Taiwanese with every single syllable. Like every single syllable has they call it in Chinese ban diao is the original tone, and bian diao is the change tone. And so I had memory objects for these change tones, and the same thing happened. Like I would just see that object in my head, and I knew I didn't have to think about decoding. It just automatically. So it's like you're setting up a tract in your mind, and you go through that decoding process. But then at some point, your brain just starts jumping. It just completely gets rid of the track and jumps directly to the results. Yeah. And that to me is like, it's insane. It's just so cool when it happens.
It is insane, and I think the answer to it is procedural memory. It becomes a procedure, and it feels very strange. I talked with Brad Zupp on a recording a long time ago, not that long ago, but anyway, and we were talking about the phenomenon where you're memorizing a deck of cards, and you will not have time to encode the last couple ones, but you'll remember them anyway. And it's the weirdest feeling in the world, because you didn't encode them, and yet you'll still get them. And I doubt it's a process of like mathematically calculating on the fly that, well, I didn't see 4 of spades here, so it must have been 4 of spades. I don't think so. I think you do it without doing it, so to speak. So it's like, be water, my friend. And that just gets us back to the
was that a Bruce Lee quote there?
But it gets us back to the time spent issue, right? And so what is the Fineman technique? Well, people talk about the Fineman technique in different ways and so forth. But at the end of the day, the Fineman technique is the technique itself, and there's time spent using the technique. So obviously, you've spent a good amount of time, not just with one Asian language, but many languages and non-Asian languages as well. So I hope that people will pay attention to this and To be honest, I think that it would be good for anybody to take the course that I took, whether they're studying an Asian language or not, simply because it's part of that Fineman level. What is the real problem here? And
Right.
what kinds of thinking tools might there be for me to pursue? And I think there'd be benefit for anybody learning to memorize some characters anyway, even if they have no interest in this, because it just shows you something about humanity. It shows you something about the nature of semantic and echoic and just all kinds of levels of information you would never sort of think about until you start plucking around. And so
Right.
I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I just want to personally thank you for it, because it's just been a great course, and I can't wait to dig deeper into it.
Well, it's a lot of pain and suffering went into that. I can't tell you how much. I mean, seriously, just the pain and suffering of learning Chinese to the level that I learned it was a lot. I mean, I'm not saying I didn't enjoy a lot of it, but it took so much more time than learning European languages. It's ridiculous. Like, in fact, I feel sorry when they're like learning Chinese. I'm like, what other languages have you learned? Like, oh, this is my first one. I'm like, oh my God, why would you choose Chinese as your first language? It's so much more effort. Like, definitely when you're finished with this, go learn Spanish, and you'll be like, oh my God, I'm running. I can't stop running. Like, 'cause it's so much easier, you know?
Right.
But yeah, when we finished that course, I was like, dude, there is no course in the world that looks like this. Like, there is no course that is anywhere near similar to this course right here. This is actually taking state-of-the-art paleographic knowledge of how characters evolve and boiling it down into a system that's simple and easy for beginners even to learn. Right. Yeah, I'm really proud of it. I'd like to, once we get more money as a company, I'd like to redo the videos and make them, a little more professional. They do the job, but I'm not going to win any Oscars or anything. But yeah, I don't know.
I know why you're saying that, but I thought they were very, very professional, and redo them at your own risk, because
right.
I have the same thing. I think, I should redo all my videos and so forth. But I actually went on calls with people, and all the best people who got the best results, and I asked them, like, what would you change, etc. And they said, don't change anything, right?
Right.
And for cosmetic reasons, like, I get it. But at the same time,
right.
I've been very, very careful, because obviously something's working. And
right.
anyway, I just give you that as a bit of feedback from the learner perspective, where
I appreciate that.
I think almost, if I was going to change anything, is I would have a video that's more about the path, and you make it clear in the course why you don't tell people which characters and so forth, but maybe some tools nonetheless, like, the top 5 things that, you might go after, and just share some stories, essentially, that just inspire people that to take the initiative, and to set maybe some missions for themselves, and what a mission might look like, and some things to think about in that realm. Just a little bit more guidance in that area. That'd be my only thing. But in terms of the videos, all look great, actually, and crisp, clean, and structured. It's just great.
Yeah, some people they want more advice from us on how to apply the knowledge. And I've purposely haven't done that, because I want to give the person room to. I don't know. I don't like people come in and say, "Hey, you do this, do this, do this, and do this, and do that." I mean, like when before I got into engineering, I was doing a 2-year degree in electronic technology, and we would have these labs where you'd have this lab book, and it'd say, "Okay, go take this piece of equipment, hook this wire up to that thing, write down what the number is on the screen at this thing here." And then, I'd do these things, and I'd do what they said. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea why I was doing it, and I had no idea what I'm supposed to gain from it. And then I had a teacher in the same department he said, "Okay, what I want you guys to do is design a voltage rectifying circuit. And then I want you to go build it, and then have a load on it, and when you get it working, come find me." And my first reaction is, even if I spent 1,000,000 years, I'm not going to be able to do this. Like, what the heck is he thinking, asking us to do this? And So he kind of explained how to design the circuits and then kind of left us to it. And, you know, I spent literally a weekend in the lab building this thing and failing and adjusting and failing and adjusting and failing. And finally I got this thing working. And I was like, and then the next day in class on Monday, he's like, oh, by the way, you just did labs 23, 25, 28, 32, and 45. And you're just like, oh my God, that was so much more meaningful than if I'd actually gone through and done those labs in the book. Because I'd have gone through that whole book and not had any idea why. I would have forgotten it all because it meant nothing to me. But now I have this very precious, in fact, that experience right here is what turned me from a, I'm going to do the least amount of schooling possible in my life person to somebody who's literally been only out of school 2 years in the last 20.
Right.
Yeah. Because learning is fun. It's a serious kick in the arm. Kick in the arm? I think I just mixed metaphors there. Shot in the arm.
Makes sense either way. But yeah, I mean, far be it from me. Al Pacino says in The Devil's Advocate, advice is the worst vice. So I'm not meaning to give advice, but it's just an idea to think about. And I think that's true. I mean, one of the best things that I ever do to people is I get them to memorize the alphabet backwards. And it sounds like I'm getting them to memorize the alphabet backwards, but actually what I'm also doing is getting them to build memory palaces and have an alphabet list, because the alphabet list is one of the best tools that you'll ever have. And then from there, it's just make it more personal. So it's like a trick exercise, and it's that sort of thing. Oh, by the way, now you have a bestiary, which is what they normally call it in the memory tradition a couple hundred years ago. But you say that word and people are like, bestiary. I don't like that word either. But nonetheless, it's a trick. The exercise is a trick, so that at the end I can say, now you've gotten through modules 26 and 27 or whatever.
Right. How did they get that name?
The bestiary. Well, because in the ancient times, or whatever period, 1500s and 1600s and so forth, they typically made their alphabet list based on animals. And often those animals would have some sort of symbolic meaning, perhaps in scripture or what have you. There would be some larger meaning. So, an ass or a donkey or a chicken or whatever is going to have more than just, oh, that's a donkey. And also often those characters would be placed in a bestiary, which would be a temple that they knew, or it would be maybe a vision of where Jesus was born, in Bethlehem or something like this. Yeah. Right. So that's part of the reason there. I just I recommend, cheerlead, etc. that animals, great. Use animals. Maybe have an animal list, but also have a celebrity list, have a family list, have a friend list, etc. Even if you can't plug in every letter, it's better than, not being able to do it. And then I share my own story, which is I develop all these lists, but ultimately what it leads to is that in the moment, if you say something, then I will just have something to work with. And I'll probably never, I won't use any of the lists often, but sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But the real skill is just to be able to generate anything. So if memory serves, you said that some term that we were talking about with like sugen, something like this. I don't know what the tones were, right? But I have instantly a Z and a G to work with, and I have multiple ones. And I just, in this case, if that worked, it worked because of just iterating based on practice of iterating. Right. So.
Yeah, actually, whenever I was doing my designing my memory story system, because the guy that did this, man, I wish I could remember his name off the top of my head. I've actually contacted him several times over the years about his system. He's a pretty eccentric kind of guy, but anyway, he actually told you, okay, you're going to need. He kind of outlined what the memory system would be. So you need a place for every syllable. Have all the syllables that start with the same initial, have that in the same place, and then traverse the thing in the same order every time, so that you have a sense of which directions to go forward and backward. But back and then I used movie characters. I'm a big movie buff. Movie characters for each place or whatnot. But back like today, it's so easy to do. You just get on IMDb.com and get a character list. Like back in those days, I literally was pulling out video VHS tapes, watching movies, or fast forwarding to the credits just to see what the characters' names were, because I'd like seen these movies, I couldn't remember that. But nowadays you can just get on the internet and it's all there for you. Yeah. So there's no excuse not to make up your system when it's so easy to do so.
That might be part of the problem, but I never want to romanticize the past, because when I read the ancient memory tradition and the people from the medieval world, they had the same problems convincing people to do this. And they had maybe not quite the abundance of resources, but they weren't lacking the resources either. So it comes back to what we were talking about before. It's just like, why do some people do it and some people don't? And if we ever solve that mystery, that'll be a Nobel Prize to be sure. But it just seems to be part of the way the world works at the end of the day.
I don't know. I think pain seems to be a big cause for people changing the way they do things. So whenever they get tired of forgetting stuff all the time, but I think also it has to do with people. Some maybe don't like my mom. Actually, I've tried to get her to use your stuff for learning German. And I try to get her to use memory techniques. And I was showing her this book about using techniques for German, and in the book, they were talking about having a bird in your mouth, and I forgot what the significance that was. But to my mother, all she could for me, I'm just thinking, okay, bird in the mouth, whatever, no big deal. And she's like, oh, that's so disgusting, and it took me days to figure out why she thought that. Well, because she's actually picturing a bird in her mouth. She's actually picturing a bird feet, which have been in all kind of nasty things, actually in her mouth and tasting it in feathers. And like for me, it's a complete abstraction. I'm just thinking, okay, bird in the mouth, okay, that's a whatever verb or whatnot. Yeah. And for her, like, so I think the fact that she's so crazy detail oriented that she has a hard time abstracting stuff.
Right.
So that, but actually I got her reading Ultra Learning. So I'm hoping,
right.
I'm hoping that she's gonna eventually get back to the memory technique stuff.
It's interesting. You know, I've been thinking about this a lot, and in memory techniques, I think a lot of it has to do with a combination of initial information display and the primacy effect. Because if that information doesn't somehow suit you in that moment, then the primacy effect is so strong that it can keep you locked out of the solution for the rest of your life, unless you're lucky enough to bounce and see it in a way that breaks the primacy effect by somebody else in some other form or fashion. And so I don't think there's a perfect answer, but I've been thinking, like, what are the other ways to explain this so that the information display has a broader appeal,
right,
and yet doesn't violate my pedagogical standards and ethics and so forth. And it's a real challenge, because it's almost like you must violate them in order for that to even happen. So you know, it's kind of like, are you going to make the world the way you want it, or are you going to tackle the world the way it really is? And I don't know. I don't know all the answers yet, but it's something very interesting now that you give the example of your mother, because at the end of the day, her brain chemistry is going to rule the way things work. And so the answer might just be, well, not that book, but maybe this one. And we maybe need
or you just teach her how to abstract stuff.
Well, yeah, and in a way, what I've tried to do, and it might be something that you can do in terms of making your course more something that more people understand the value of, is rather than trying to be the one memory solution, I get as many memory experts on the podcast as I can to open up all the broad different ways so that people see it from different angles, see the different things. Right. So maybe that's a way you can do it, is, you know, talk to more people that have your experiences and different angles and viewpoints and so forth, and have that on your YouTube channel, etc. And that can open up more angles. Because at the end of the day, something about having an abundance of perspectives makes that one door you're talking about more attractive to enter than a sort of, this is the one, because it's not even realistic. And I find in memory, most people, when I've solved something, it's because of the problems the other memory trainers have created, but they've also they've created problems because they've provided solutions. And so you know, if we just take the example of your mother and so forth, it's like, well, what taste could you imagine? Can we put some sugar on that bird? Can it be a fantasy bird that actually, you know, is just
Yeah,
the
do
most
something to make it
amazing.
palatable for,
Right.
like literally in this case, but
Yeah. It's like the amazing cinnamon bird, you know?
right.
Whatever food in the German that they're trying to get you to, or whatever grammatical principle. It's like, well, that principle starts with D, or the word starts with D. So, oh, well, what about a donut, you know? And
Right.
so maybe that's part of the path. I don't know. But
That's another thing I use memory techniques for, is grammatical gender for nouns in European languages.
yes.
Yeah. Real
do
quick,
you go?
one thing I think it might also be a problem, and I don't know how to solve it. I'm just pointing out what I think it could be. Is that I've noticed is learning languages, and with, like, especially I used to just read grammar books, whether I understood them or not, because I just
Right.
wanted to expose myself to certain ideas. And I noticed that you have tiers of knowledge, and a certain point requires, and maybe it's a tier of experience or a tier of knowledge, I'm not really sure, but once you have this tier of knowledge, like maybe the grammar point you're reading is 3 tiers up and you're on tier 1. Well, you really have no chance of understanding that thing,
Right.
because it's just not going to be open to you, because you don't have the experience or the background knowledge to take it in. But then, which is fine, that doesn't mean you can't read it. Just read about it and don't worry too much about it, and then just save it for later. And then you start building up these tiers, and you reread it again. Suddenly it becomes instantaneously obvious to you why that's the case, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the memory stuff, whether it's attractive or not to somebody who doesn't use memory techniques, has to do with, it could be where they are in their, I don't know how to even say this, their awareness maybe of their learning, or their awareness of their needs. Like, a lot of people aren't aware of their needs.
Right.
Like in this Chinese character pedagogy stuff, like I said, I've spent 6 years in a program for teaching Chinese as a foreign language, and so I've got a lot of experience being around Chinese teachers that are actually Chinese, speakers. And they'll say, "Oh, well, my students tell me this about learning characters." I'm like, I hate to tell you this, but they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
And why do I say that? Well, because it's like this one guy on the internet, I won't even name a name, but there's this one guy on the internet that just loves to mess with us. And he hasn't actually mastered Chinese characters. He knows, 1,500, 2,000, something like that. But he can't read. And then he's telling me how to do stuff. And I'm just like, well, if there was a mountain that was really hard to climb, and 95% of the people that try to climb this mountain fail, are you going to listen to the guy halfway up the mountain, or are you going to listen to the 5 people on top of the mountain?
Right.
It's like, and I didn't tell him he was the one halfway up the mountain, but it was obvious the way I said it. In the same way, the student says, what they're actually telling you is, what's effective for me to remember this stuff for my test on Tuesday,
Right.
which is a completely different thing from actually mastering this thing and being able to call it at will 2 years down the road. Those are completely different problems. So you can't listen to what they're saying about the test next Tuesday as to whether or not they're going to be able to use this stuff long term. And it's like a calculus teacher. Nobody goes and asks the calculus teacher, ask their student, well, what do you think's, well, I think I just lost my analogy in my head, but.
Well, I mean, part of the issue, I think I always frame it as existing competence, right?
Right.
And to the extent to which you actually are willing to build from your existing competence. So instead of thinking about, 5 years in the future and all the wonderful things you want to be able to do in 5 years, where are you now? And what is the most logical step towards getting one step ahead? And when you talk about experts and so forth, I'll never forget Nelson Dellis being on a recording that we did, and he's climbed Mount Everest, and he said that a lot of memory and learning is just like climbing Mount Everest. You know that you want to get to the top, but there's only one thing you focus on, which is where your hand goes
the next step, right.
The next step, right? And so many people just get blinded by the goal, and they don't look at what's right in front of them. And so much wisdom is just in that. And, I just think that part of our job is always just keeping the focus, and I have to do it to myself every day, keep the focus back on the next step with something in mind about the top of the mountain. Whether I've been to the top of the mountain before or not, I still got to get there. But whether I've been there 1,000 times or one time before or no times before, it's still the next step.
But yeah, I agree with that. And the thing is, like, there's two things going on here, and I'm not really sure what they are. But one of them is finding the next step. But also, you need to be aiming at the goal. I mean, I'm not saying, like, if I'm on Mount Everest, I'm not necessarily looking up at the top. But in my mind, I know that I'm trying to get to the top. Right. And that's why I'm choosing my next step. Because if I was trying to get, like, on the next mountain over there, I'm not going to choose my next step as being up, right? I'm going to choose as going back down to get to where I'm trying to go. And like, I don't mean to rag on Taiwanese people, but I just have a lot of experience teaching Taiwanese people English pronunciation. And when you hear a lot of people speak, it's obvious they speak like they've never heard English before in their life. And they've memorized letters, but a letter can't actually teach you a sound. A letter can only excite a sound that's already in your head. So if that sound isn't already there, guess what's going to happen? You're going to put your sound in there because that's the only thing you got to put in there. Right? So, because this is one of the things I tell them is you need to aim at the target. Like, you're trying to learn English, but what you're doing here is you're not even aiming at actual English. Like, if you hear somebody say, I'm just thinking of, I don't know, I randomly make a word, kitchen. If you want to learn how to say the word kitchen, you need to hear a native speaker say kitchen. And whenever you yourself want to say the English word kitchen, you need to hear that native speaker saying it in your head, and then you're mimicking that sound. And even if you don't get it right the first few times, if you have the sound in your head and you're mimicking it every time, eventually you're gonna collapse onto the actual real sound. Yeah. If, on the other hand, you're thinking of letters in your head, you're always going to be doing your sound. Because the sound you're not even aiming at the thing you're trying to do. Right. You're doing stuff kind of blindly because other people are doing it or your teacher told you to do it. I don't know why, for whatever reason. But I'm not saying the other thing the guy says is not true. I think they're both true, but perhaps applicable at different times or something.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's certainly not a dogmatic truism, but I think part of the issue we're getting at is that sometimes you got to be climbing just one mountain at a time, and sometimes you got to climb two mountains at the same time. But one way or the other, it really matters that you know which mountains you're climbing at the end of the day. So, yes, I think
that's where expert advice can really help, though. Is like somebody who's already been up. That's why people hire guides to go up mountains, because they've been there before. To them, this isn't a first-time problem. This is something they've already solved a bunch of times. So you hire a guide to show you the way. That's kind of what teachers are supposed to be. You're supposed to take somebody, from not knowing something to knowing something, or even better, you teach them how to figure out how to go from that, and then they can do it on their. In fact, that's actually our course is not about teaching you characters. It's about teaching you how to learn how to master the art of learning characters, so that you can just take off and go do it on your own once you've taken the course.
Yeah, and I think you've done marvelously at it. So
I appreciate
it. I think we can already book another conversation for sure. Maybe more focus on some of the other things you've got coming out. But speaking of which, if people want to learn more, where can they find you, and what is coming up next for you on your website?
Well, we're at www.outlier-linguistics.com, which is kind of a mouthful, but and it's actually funny about the name Outlier is a lot of non-native English speakers, they really don't like that word for some reason. It's like it's not a normal word they learn in school, and I'm like, it's just a statistical concept. But so it's www.outlier-linguistics.com, and so we have a ton of stuff coming up. I was just telling you earlier that I was working on this software to do these expert entries. So I'm really close to finishing the software, which means a month or a month and a half down the road, we're going to have about 100 or 200 new expert entries come out. We only got like 40 right now, so that's a lot. Right. And we're hoping to get, I'll send you a list actually of characters that have expert entries, and you can read them. And in Plico, you kind of have to scroll to the bottom of the entry, and it says expert, and you have to click on that.
All right.
But like because it's actually telling the real story. Like, well, basically telling a simplified version of the real story. I'll say it that way. So the essential stuff is what you need to know to learn the character, but the real story is actually how this character evolved and I find it fast. Of course I do. That's why I'm getting a PhD in it. But
Right.
most people that read it really enjoy it. So we're going to have a bunch of expert entries coming out very soon. That's one thing. We have system level data that we're adding to the essentials version. So that will like, when you have a character that has a sound component, you'll be able to see the other characters that have that same sound component and see how the sounds can vary in that series of characters that have that same sound component. Or you can see this component is normally used as a semantic component or normally used as a sound component. You can like look at a system level data, and we actually have this data already. Edsko, the Dutch guy I was talking about, he's a programmer, and he was wanting to do this for himself. Well, he produced all this data for us, and so once I'm done with this software, then I can start taking his data and put it in a format that we can send to Plico in. So that's going to be happening. The pronunciations course is going to be starting in September. Are we in September right now?
Yeah, we
are.
In Australia, but not sure about Texas.
Yeah. So, well, I have to ask John because that's kind of what he's doing. But so the pronunciation course is going to teach you and I had this problem too. Like, it's really funny because John and I are polar opposite learners. John is a very intuitive learner and he's very smart, so he picks up stuff really fast. Whereas for me, I have to stop and break everything down into parts, and then I master the parts and then I put it back together. But with like pronunciation, he pronounces stuff really, really well, but he's never had to struggle through doing this. To him, it's kind of natural. But for me, like I said, I went from fluent toneless Chinese to fluent, mostly correct tones. Right. I wouldn't say I'm 100% correct, but it's mostly correct. And so I actually understand this process of, and I also know what I went through. Like I kind of ignored them in the beginning because I didn't know what to deal with. I didn't know how to deal with them. Right. So we're going to show you how to deal with them, how to practice, give you stuff to practice, such that, and if you're going to learn Chinese, it's in addition to spending time ahead of time learning about memory stuff, because you guarantee you will use that. But I always recommend to everybody, if you want to learn Chinese, I say take as long as it takes, but that's different for different people. So take 3 months and only focus on tones. Don't do anything else. Don't talk. Don't try to say hello to people. Just master these tones. I mean, you can learn actual words, but focus on those tones for months. Because otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation like I did, where I had to go back and correct all of my words that I knew. And in fact, the ones that I usually don't say right are words that I've known for the longest.
Right. Primacy.
And I always know when it comes out too, because the people's face totally like contorts and like, what did I say? Oh, like in English we just say mala chicken or whatever.
Right.
Right. Well, I said, I was talking to an American guy that speaks perfect Chinese, and I was talking and a Taiwanese guy, and we're talking, and I said, oh yeah, 我很喜欢那个麻辣鸡, and they were like, what? And I was like, I must have said a tone wrong. I said, and they're like, 什么叫做麻辣鸡? I mean, no, I meant 麻辣鸡.
Right.
Like 麻辣 instead of 麻辣.
Right.
And like, it's just because I had learned it wrong initially. So 20 years later, I'm still paying for my mistakes from, and this happens every so often. So, and then there's also been people who come to Taiwan and they're like gung-ho about going and talking to everybody as much as they can. And it's just, it doesn't really work out very well. Right. But if they had spent 3 months mastering tones, like single tone, not just single tones, but tones in combination, because the tone contours actually change. This is another problem with people learning Chinese, that what you get told and what is actually real aren't the same. Right. Like if you say Ming, like bright, right? Ming. Yeah. But when you say tomorrow, 明天, the pitch actually is higher. It goes up to meet the first tone. So it's not just Ming Tian, it's actually Ming Tian,
Right.
Ming Tian. So, and there's a lot of these little adjustments that have to be made. But if you start in the very beginning knowing that's going to happen and then trying to listen and mimic it, you'll be way better off.
Well, Ash, thank you so much for being here today. And I really hope everyone, will go over to outlier-linguistics.com. Is that in my memory correctly? Yeah. And again, I can only say I've benefited so much from going through the course. It's just the beginning of the adventure, of course, but I can see, as I mentioned, that this is a great way of getting much further, much faster, and looking forward to that. So thank you so much for having a straight and direct training and something that creates more tools than I really was expecting.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on. I'm really excited that you were able to take the course and that you got something out of it. And I think the memory stuff and what we're doing has a lot in common, in that we could leverage each other's knowledge and talents to make a better world. To be a little bit dramatic.
I don't think it's dramatic at all, and let's definitely do that and have a chat again on this podcast in the near future.
Cool.